Good morning. Today is the 28th day of Kislev, the 4th day of Chanukah, and the 11th of December. I think Mikeitz, we're now in the second reading of Mikeitz, but I'm going to try to do both the first and second one today because I missed it yesterday. I think Mikeitz is probably one of my most favorite Torah portions, thanks to Joseph and his dream interpretation. I think that what happens in this parsha is simply phenomenal and has so much to do with the human psyche and how we function and how we think. In the Wonders, there's a lot of material on this, and there's so much more material that I don't know if I'm going to stick to the Wonders. I'm probably going to go off in a different direction that's not there. But let's start from the very beginning. When Joseph, in the first reading, when Joseph is taken out of the pit or out of the jail, and he's brought back, he's brought before Pharaoh. The sages say that night when he was preparing to be taken before Pharaoh, the angel Gabriel came and taught him all 70 languages. And we need to look at this a tiny bit just to understand the context here. What is the angel Gabriel doing here, and why is this all happening? If you're a dream interpreter, dreams, as we'll see, have a lot to do with language. You have to be a master of the language that you're speaking in order to interpret dreams, because dreams are basically the mind taking rational thought, taking it apart, putting it back together in strange ways. And so if you don't understand the imagery, the symbolism, everything that goes together in those images that you now see in your dream, and the images are basically like interpretations of these words that are being permuted in your head while you dream. So if you don't know the full gamut of human language, and certainly to understand Pharaoh's dreams, you have to know a lot, because Pharaoh was taught many languages like all kings. And so Joseph had to know even more than him. And that's exactly what happened, that when he came before Pharaoh, he both understood his language, the higher Egyptian language, the language that Pharaoh was dreaming in. He understood everything. But he also understood something that Pharaoh didn't understand, and we'll see this in a moment. He didn't understand the holy tongue. He didn't understand the Hebrew language. So Joseph learns these languages in order to be able to stand before Pharaoh and do what he's supposed to do with this dream interpretation. Now, why do the sages say that it was the angel Gabriel? Is because Gabriel, like we discussed this already in the past a couple of times already, I think in Parshat Noach and a little bit later again, in regards to the Tower of Babylon, that the left side of the brain is about language. And in order to increase the amount of language that a person knows, there has to be some influx of left-sided language. I think we mentioned this even, that there's this concept of mother tongue, or in Yiddish they say mama loshen, means the same thing, basically my mother tongue. The language comes from the mother. It's very interesting though that usually in English and in Hebrew, there's a lot of other languages also, the first word that the child usually says is not mother. It's not the ma sound, it's rather the ba sound, which is associated with the father. But in general, language is connected to the left side, the left hemisphere of the brain, and that is what the angel Gabriel represents. He's the left side. Gabriel comes from the word gvura, which means might, and that's the sphere of gvura, which is on the left axis. There's something even deeper about this, that the average value of each one of his letters is equal to 41. If we take Gabriel's name and we divide it by 6, so we find that the average value is 41. That's the value of mother, M. So we see that there's a very strong leaning here to giving Joseph something that he was missing. And in fact, it even says in the Medrash that he added a letter to his name. And so we know him as Joseph, but there's a number of times especially in Psalms, that he's called Yosef. He has an additional hey, a letter hey added to his name, and that hey is both the hey of understanding, the mother principle, and it's also the hey of kingship, because the hey is in God's four-letter name. The hey is both the understanding and the kingdom, and so that's what the angel Gabriel gave him. That's regarding the first reading. About the second reading, I was going to say the most important thing about it, and we'll say that in just a minute, so we can tie the first reading and the second reading together. So in the second reading, we were going to focus on the verse: the 7 healthy cows are 7 years, and the 7 healthy ears of wheat or produce, whatever he saw there, are 7 years. It is the same dream. The sages say, based on the words, that nobody could solve. There are words, the Torah actually says, nobody could solve the dream for Pharaoh. Not that they couldn't solve the dream or interpret the dream. They couldn't interpret it to Pharaoh's liking. And from this they learned that Pharaoh knew what the correct interpretation was, because he had dreamt it. Just like last week we saw, or maybe we didn't see, I don't remember, that the baker and the vineyard, they both also dreamt the interpretation of their dreams, but each one dreamt the interpretation of the other one's dream. So they knew what the correct interpretation was. In this case, Pharaoh also knew, but he had forgotten. So the dream interpreters that he had in his palace were trying to explain to him, what are these 7 cows? What are these 7 ears of or bushels of wheat? What are they? And they kept doing the same thing. They said, well, 7 cows is 7 countries that you will conquer. And the 7 decrepit cows that eat them up, it means you're going to lose those same 7 countries. And then they came up with another idea. Maybe it's 7 daughters you'll give birth to, and then 7 will die. They had all these interesting, different, just switching it around. So you saw one thing, it symbolizes something else. What did Joseph do? He said the 7 healthy cows are 7 years. What Joseph did, he switched dimensions. That was his greatness. And he does this all the time. We saw this also in last week's Parsha. He did this for the baker and for the wine, for the cupbearer also. Same thing. They saw 3 vines, or they saw 3 baskets of bread. And he said to them, it's not an object. What you're seeing is a representation of time. And that is Joseph's genius. And the reason I call this genius is because to be able to see something and see a different dimension in it, that requires true inspiration. That really requires a person to be able to break out of the mold of his thought, because when I tell you about objects, you'll replace them with objects. And that's exactly what Freud does, and everybody does dream interpretation the same way. Joseph's genius is to understand that sometimes the object is a representation of a completely different dimension. Objects are not time, right? Objects are 3-dimensional extensions in space. And here you have an object that is actually representing time. So in that sense, Joseph is the first Einstein. He understands the connection between space and time. He understands the connection between objects and time. But I said before that he also knew a language that Pharaoh didn't know. He knew Hebrew. There's a wonderful discourse from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who asks, we'll see this in I think that's in tomorrow's reading, who told Joseph, actually it's in today's, who told Joseph to not only interpret the dream, but to also offer advice? Joseph was called upon to interpret the dream, not to tell Pharaoh what to do. Now there's a lot of deep thoughts about this whole thing, and we won't have time to get into it today. Maybe we'll do a little bit more tomorrow. But Joseph oversteps his boundaries, because after he finishes interpreting, he says to uncalled upon, he says to Pharaoh, let Pharaoh seek out a man of discernment and wisdom and put him in charge of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take steps to appoint officials over the land and prepare Egypt during the 7 years of plenty. Let them gather all the food during these coming good years, and let them store grain under Pharaoh's control for the food in the cities and guard it. So he says, look, Pharaoh, if you want to survive the famine that's coming, there'll be 7 good years, but then it's going to be 7 years of famine. If you want to survive this, if you want Egypt to continue being the world superpower during this famine and not be destroyed, you'd better get ready. And you need someone who can get you ready. And he says exactly what needs to be done. You need to gather all the food, and then he says you have to do something more. What do I need you to do once you gather all the food? The translation here doesn't capture the word. It's not just gather the food. Joseph did it according to a certain calculation. He said 20% of everything that is grown will go into Pharaoh's storehouses. We'll talk about this 20% later on, I think in the 6th reading on Friday. We'll see what that means exactly. But here, who asked him to give advice? And why does Pharaoh actually listen to him? The explanation that the Lubavitcher Rebbe gives is fantastic. He says, there's a word that Pharaoh never said this word, but it was implied. I'll explain what I mean. The Torah repeats the dreams twice. Once the way Pharaoh sees it, the second time the way Pharaoh relates the dream. The way that he sees it, there's an interesting word there. And it says like this, that the seven good cows that emerged, the robust cows emerged from the Nile and started grazing in the marsh. And then 7 other cows, ugly and scrawny, emerged after them from the Nile River, and they stood next to the good-looking cows on the bank of the Nile River. Yosef notices the word standing next to was unneeded for the dream. And again, Joseph didn't hear this word because this is when the Torah is relating what Pharaoh saw, not what Pharaoh said. But it's even implied. You can get it from the way Pharaoh describes things when he does describe it. There's an amazing thing about this word, they stood. It doesn't exist in English, but it exists in Hebrew. When I say that something is standing, I mean that it is in the present tense. It's called Zman Omid, present tense, standing time. What did Joseph understand? Joseph understood that during the years of plenty, when the cows are grazing, symbolizing the years of plenty, the famine should be standing present next to you during those years, meaning there is a way to collect the produce of the 7 years in order to ensure that there's food for the 7 years of famine. There is a way. What does that mean? Again, that the famine is standing in your presence all the time. You see it in front of you. You understand during the years of plenty that you need to be planning and stocking up for the years of famine. Normally you would think maybe there's no way to do this because food spoils. How long can you keep grain in silos? But Joseph found the explanation. This has to do with our lectures on faith and confidence. I'll talk more about this on Friday. But I want you to remember this word it's vata'amodna in Hebrew. It means they stood next to them. And it means present tense. I'm going to take up 2 more minutes of your time because there is an amazing thing that came to me a few years ago while I was praying on Shabbat Mikeitz of, I think, 5 years ago. And I noticed that in the selection from the prophets, we have this same word, vata'amodna. The selection from the prophets does not seem to be connected to the portion. The selection from the prophets is the dream that Solomon has upon being anointed king. And he becomes the king of Israel. And the next day, and during the dream, God asks him, what do you want? And he says, I want wisdom. So God says, because you didn't ask me for riches and for this and for that, I give you everything plus the wisdom. So he goes back to Jerusalem, and the first thing he has is the famous Solomon trial of the two women that come to him, and they have one child, and each one says, it's my child. The other one says, no, your child died during the night, you took mine, and so on and so forth. It says that the two women stood before Solomon. They stood before him. What does it mean that they stood before him? Of course you have to stand. There's actually a word, I don't know how they say it in English, but it's called the right to stand. The right to stand, there's definitely a judicial term that has to do with that, is who can stand in front of a court and make a claim. Not everybody can stand in front of every court. If you want to take someone to court, you can't go straight to the Supreme Court. You have to go through a whole process. So there's a standing right. You have the right to stand in front of a circuit court maybe, or something like that, something lower. And then if the case is not finished, it goes higher and higher and you get the right to standing. And in general, you can't bring anyone you want. The court has to approve. It's called the right to stand. So they stood before him. So it's definitely a legal term. But if we take this idea that this is a very rare word in the Bible, and it appears both in Pharaoh's dream and in this court case that Solomon tries. Here it meant that the two cows were actually two sides of the same thing. While there was plenty, you had to remember that on the other side there's famine. So I want you to think about this. If anybody can solve this, I'll be very happy to hear. What does it mean that these two women that stood before Solomon were two sides of the same coin? And if we understand it that way, I'll tell you what I think about it tomorrow. If we understand it that way, then we can understand why Solomon did this supposedly horrendous idea, let's cut the baby in half. Why did that solve the problem? Think about that image. These two women are two sides of the same coin. Just like the two cows here are two sides of the same coin, they have to do with time. They're not actually two women. That's the hint. There weren't actually two women. That's the idea here. And the way to solve their problem was by suggesting that the child be cut in half, and suddenly they both come to an agreement, and everything turns out properly. So we'll talk more about this tomorrow. I realize it's a little cryptic, but a little thought. Maybe somebody will come up with a different answer than the one I came up with, and we'll discuss it, God willing, tomorrow. Thanks for joining. Sorry for taking up longer than usual. Happy Hanukkah to everyone, full of light, and hopefully a little bit later today, in about 3 hours, I might give an impromptu class in English if somebody wants to watch Facebook, follow Facebook. If you're on Facebook, then you might be able to see it.
What is the class?
It'll be on Hanukkah, on the meaning of the candles. It depends on if the people that I'm inviting over are game for hearing something a half an hour or an hour long. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. And I say, shalom, shalom.